and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Nicole Lindstrom from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York, and I will be chairing the event today. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker and a friend, Laura Beers, to you this evening. Laura is a historian of modern Britain and author of the award-winning Red Ellen, The Life of Ellen Wilkinson, Socialist, Feminist, Internationalist, and Your Britain, Media and the Making of the Labour Party. A professor at American University in Washington, D.C., she comments frequently on British politics for CNN and the BBC. Laura is going to speak to us tonight about her latest book, Orwell's Ghosts, revealing Orwell in all of his complexity, exploring his commitment to political liberty and economic justice alongside his undeniable chauvinism. She will explore how all of his books show remarkable resonance between the first half of the 20th century and today's world. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out today on the first sunny day in what I hear has been quite a while. So I appreciate your giving up the opportunity to sit in a garden and barbecue and drink a beer to hear about Orwell. And thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. Like Nicole, I am an American who's lived for a long time in Britain. So I will try to speak slowly and intelligibly. But I wanted to start off because when I was young and straight out of undergrad, I worked briefly in the publicity department of Oxford University Press and had to write jacket copy for books. And so I have great sympathy for those who do. But I think that the young person who wrote the jacket copy for the American edition of my book did a really good job of summarizing it. So in a nod to him or her, I will start out by reading from. And there's good jacket copy in the British version too, which I hope you all buy after this talk, but this is from the American one. George Orwell dedicated his career to exposing social injustice and political duplicity, urging his readers to face hard truths about Western society and politics. Now, the uncanny parallels between the interwar era and our own, rising inequality, censorship, and challenges to traditional social hierarchies make his writing even more of the moment. Invocations of Orwell in his classic dystopian novel, 1984, have reached new heights, with both sides of the political spectrum embracing the rhetoric of Orwellianism. In Orwell's Ghost, historian Laura Beers, that's me, considers Orwell's full body of work, his 6 novels, 3 nonfiction works, and brilliant essays on politics, language, and the class system, to examine what Orwellian truly means and reveal the misconstrued thinker in all his complexity. So, I wanted to emphasize the fact that this book is, when we think about the current moment in which we live, when we think about the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza, and the upcoming elections in both Britain and the United States, it's hard not to think that we are living in a kind of 1984-style dystopia. And certainly, but for those valences, the book would not have been written. But it isn't just a kind of musing on whether or not 2024 is the new 1984, but rather an attempt to look at Orwell's political writing and his fiction writing as well in the round and use it as a lens to kind of reevaluate the moment we're living in now. So I wanted to start out just to get a sense from the audience of the familiarity that you guys are bringing to George Orwell as you come to sit here for this talk today. And how many people have read Orwell at some point? So virtually all of you. Though the book is intended to be accessible to those who have not and to encourage people who are coming to Orwell new to open the pages of his books. But let's go, how many people have read Animal Farm? Oh, nearly all of you. What about 1984? What about Homage to Catalonia? Oh, still a good number of hands, right? What about let's get slightly more recherche? How about Keep the Aspidistra Flying? All right, a few of you. How about The Lion and the Unicorn? Right, so, and then we get fewer, right? So he has a corpus of better-known works, but also a kind of a deep bench, as they say, and the book does explore his thinking as articulated both in all 7 of his book-length works and also his political essays. So I'm going to talk about some of that thinking today. And it is also very much, this is a book that is my interpretation of Orwell. So you're getting a good bit of Laura Beers as well as a good bit of George Orwell. And if some of you might recognize this statue, this is the statue of Orwell at Broadcasting House in London. And it emblazoned in front of it is the quote, if liberty means anything, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. And Orwell briefly worked for the BBC during the Second World War. He produced broadcasts for the British Raj, where in his youth he'd worked as a police officer in Burma, something I'll talk more about, to try to rustle up support for the war in a region that was very ambivalent about Britain, the empire, and the global conflict. So he didn't particularly like his time at the BBC. He didn't own a radio, but the BBC has adopted him as one of their icons. And I think partially that's because of his commitment to telling the truth, and also because of his skills as a writer and as a reporter. And his language and the beauty of his language really comes through in everything that he writes. And I've sort of strove to give a sense of that in the book. So I now want to sort of step back a bit and talk about what inspired me to write Orwell's Ghost. And as I said, though Orwell is much more than 1984, it really was these allusions to 1984 and to the idea of what is Orwellian that started to really, particularly after the January 6th insurrection in the United States, you started to hear more and more about references to Orwellianism. And so these are 2 tweets from Missouri Senator Josh Hawley and from Donald Trump Jr., Trump's son, issued in the immediate wake of the January 6th insurrection. So if some of you remember, Trump was banned from Twitter after January 6th and was only recently allowed back on the platform now known as X by Elon Musk once he took it over. Elon Musk has a t-shirt that says, "What would Orwell think?" and clearly also believes himself to be a kind of a free speech crusader in the model of Orwell as he understands it. But when Trump was kicked off of Twitter, his son then tweeted the next day, "We are living in Orwell's 1984. Free speech no longer exists in America. It died with big tech, and what's left is only there for a chosen few." And then equally, some of you may remember there was quite a famous image, I don't know how widely it circulated in the UK, after the insurrection of Josh Hawley kind of giving a fist up to the insurrectionists during the attack on the Capitol, and afterwards Simon & Schuster canceled his book contract, saying he didn't represent their values. And he too claimed, "This could not be more Orwellian. Simon & Schuster is canceling my contract because I am representing my constituents, leading a debate on the Senate floor on voter integrity, which they have now decided to redefine as sedition." And he sort of goes on in his rant and says, "I'll see you in court." Ultimately, he did not win that, and his book came out with a smaller, very right-wing press. But for Trump and for Hawley, the Orwell that they knew and the way that they understood Orwell was as a crusader for free speech. And particularly, I think, in a Cold War context, as an anti-socialist crusader for free speech, which is, I don't know about those of you sitting here, but certainly how Orwell was introduced to me when I first read him in school. And I want to go ahead, actually, and read from a part of the book where I talk about the Orwell of Josh Hawley and Donald Trump Jr.'s understanding, which was also, when I first came to Orwell, the Orwell of my own understanding. So I first read George Orwell as a 12-year-old schoolgirl during the dying days of the Cold War. I know it's hard to believe looking at me. When Animal Farm was considered an ideal vehicle to teach Western students about the perils of Soviet totalitarianism and to inculcate the virtues of America's commitment to free speech and the protection of political dissent. I went on to read 1984 in high school English, where my teacher made analogies between Big Brother and Joseph Stalin and the cult of personality, and spelled out the connections between Newspeak and Room 101 and Soviet censorship and the torture and repression of the Gulag. Donald Trump Jr. is a year older than I am. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley is a year younger. For American children of our generation, as for children throughout the West, the Orwell we were taught in school was a Cold Warrior, an anti-communist crusader against thought policing and dictatorial repression. If I had left Orwell behind in high school, I can imagine having sympathy for Trump and Hawley's claims, made in the aftermath of January 6, 2021, that Orwell, the anti-Stalinist Tribune, beloved of Reaganite and Thatcher-era school curricula, would have been on their side. But I didn't leave Orwell behind. In college, I read his indictments of racial oppression based on his experience as an imperial officer in Burma, and his writings on unemployment and poverty in Britain and France. I read Homage to Catalonia, in which Orwell details his bitter disillusionment with the promise of Soviet communism, and his realization that in practice, Stalinism differed little from Nazi fascism. I also gained my first taste of Orwell's journalism, which to a greater extent than his book-length writings, highlights the dangers to liberty posed by fascist totalitarianism. The image in 1984 of Big Brother's tyranny as a boot stamping on a human face forever is a clear allusion not to Stalinism, but to the jackbooted SS officers who tyrannized Jews and other perceived enemies of the state in Nazi Germany. And so the image that, the Orwell of this book is not Orwell the Cold Warrior, but Orwell the man and fool, who objected to oppression in the Soviet Union, certainly, but also domestically in Britain and in the British Empire, and was concerned about Nazi fascism and the politics of the right, and that is what inspires him to fight on behalf of the Republic in the Spanish Civil War, as he was about the totalitarianism of the left. So hold on, I'm just gonna make sure I don't go over time. Here we go. And so using Orwell as a vehicle to think about the politics of the 1930s and 1940s is something that I had always wanted to do in my own teaching. And so now, 8 years ago, just after 2016, I was teaching at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and I proposed a third-year advanced option on Orwell. And it was meant to be reading Orwell alongside the history of the 30s and 40s and using Orwell to think about the 30s and 40s. But almost immediately, my students began making comparisons between Orwell's writing on the past and events then unfolding in the present. And those events included, very prominently when we think about taking ourselves back in time 8 years, the campaign around Brexit and what they saw as the intentional manipulation of truth and disinformation that went along with the Leave campaign. And so then I left, ultimately. I had my second son, and I didn't teach for a while, and then I went back to teaching in the United States. And I reprised this course on Orwell in a different context for the first time during the pandemic. And again, then, my students repeatedly drew these connections between the world in which Orwell was living and writing and the events of the present. And you can see these in the way that Orwell has been invoked in discussions over Putin's action in Ukraine and his unwillingness to refer to the war as opposed to a liberating action, to the culture in Xi's China, both in Hong Kong and in terms of his treatment of the Uyghur population. And also, particularly in a US context, to political events, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's attempts to pass anti-woke Don't Say Gay laws, which actually this is a report of a Florida state court knocking back those laws at the university level, saying they infringed upon free speech and invoking Orwell, and specifically invoking 1984, saying it was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13, which some of you might remember as the opening line of 1984. and the powers in charge of Florida's public university system have declared the state has unfettered authority to muzzle its professors in the name of freedom. And this is positively dystopian. So you get these very explicit connections being drawn both in the US context, but also then by protesters in Hong Kong, and you crucially thinking about audience, and this is meant to be photographed and disseminated, right? He's got, his sign is written both in English and then in what I hope is Mandarin, and I'm not, I think is Mandarin. And then again, this is the Ukrainian Tribune, which is a both Ukrainian and English language journal. So drawing those connections between, you can see INGSOC, which is the government in 1984, and the image of Big Brother being juxtaposed with Vladimir Putin. So those connections really inspired me to write the book. But as I did, I wanted to go beyond just thinking about truth and fake news, even though I think the issue of truth and fake news is one that is really central to Orwell's enduring political message and his enduring relevance. And in that, I want to read briefly from, this is a passage this time not of my writing, but of Orwell's. And it's not from 1984, and it's not from Animal Farm, but it's from his political journalism and his reporting during the Second World War. And I think it gives you a real sense of how he saw the possible manipulation of the truth as something that was not only a problem in totalitarian dictatorships, but which is something that democracies could equally fall victim to. So this is his reporting on the aerial bombardment of Britain by the Luftwaffe. Now, we are aware, and this is his writing on the exaggerated reports the Nazis were putting out in terms of the number of raids that had gone out and the number of targets they had hit. Now, we are aware that those raids did not happen. But what use would our knowledge be if the Germans conquered Britain? For the purposes of a future historian, did those raids happen or didn't they? The answer is, if Hitler survives, they happen. And if he falls, they didn't happen. So with innumerable other events of the past 10 or 20 years. Did Trotsky plot with the Nazis? How many German airplanes were shot down in the Battle of Britain? Does Europe welcome the New Order? In no case do you get one answer which is universally accepted because it is true. In each case, you get a number of totally incompatible answers, one of which is finally adopted as the result of physical struggle. History is written by the winners. And then he goes on to, in a very backhanded compliment, say about Britain that the only real argument for Britain winning the war is that they'd probably tell fewer lies about it than the Nazis. But he doesn't say that they wouldn't tell lies about it, right? I mean, he's very cynical, not just about the distortions of truth in dictatorship, but also of the mistruths and manipulation of fact that take place in purported democracies, such as Britain during the Second World War. And I think if we think about the sort of tragic events unfolding in Gaza and the dual and completely incompatible narratives of what is happening there that are coming out of Hamas and Netanyahu's government, you can see the way that his statement that history is written by the winners and which of those versions goes down in the history books as true is going to depend on how the conflict ends as something that very much resonates today. And I think the same probably holds true in Ukraine. But one of the things that I think is really important to remember about Orwell is that he does think it's important that if Britain won, they would tell fewer lies than Germany, even if they wouldn't tell none at all. And he is an advocate of free speech. He's a strong advocate of free speech throughout his career, but he's also an advocate of true speech. And so reading again from the book, This Is Me, This Time Not Orwell. Orwell's commitment to objective truth explains why he describes the essence of freedom in 1984 as the right to say that 2 + 2 = 4, not the right to say that 2 + 2 = 5. I noted in the introduction, I sort of very clear that I think it's dangerous to ascribe opinions to someone who's long dead and can't come back and say, you've got me all wrong. Yet here I think the weight and consistency of the evidence is overwhelming. In a free society, citizens theoretically should be able to proclaim 2 + 2 to be whatever they want it to be. But that is not Orwell's idea of freedom from censorship. Orwell believed in liberty above all else, but liberty, in his view, was predicated on an assumption of personal and social responsibility. And I think it's fair to say that Orwell probably would not have embraced former Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway's view that there are facts and there are alternative facts, and which ones you put forward is largely irrelevant. So I want to also, though, use part of my time in this talk, and I'm conscious that I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A, so I'm not going to go on too long, but to talk about some of the other spaces that Orwell experienced and wrote about, and where he saw manipulation of truth and disinformation and exploitation as a serious problem. And one of them is in the British Raj in Burma, in the empire. Orwell is actually, he's born, his given name is not George Orwell, but Eric Blair. He takes the name George Orwell after St. George and the Orwell River, which is near where his parents have retired to on the South Coast, when he publishes his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London in 1933. And I think it's a crucial thing to recognize about Orwell in terms of Orwell's class politics, that although he sees himself as a defender of the impoverished and a fighter against social inequality, that he takes his pen name in part so as not to embarrass his very middle-class parents, as he writes about going slumming in Paris and London. But he's born Eric Blair, and he stays Eric Blair, well, beyond 1933, but at least into the publication of that first book. He's a member, as he describes himself, of the lower upper middle class. He goes to boarding school and then on to Eton. And when he graduates from Eton, he joins the Imperial Police in Burma. His father had been an Indian civil servant. The empire had run strong in his family. His great-great-grandfather was a large-scale slave owner in the Caribbean, and that's where most of the family wealth initially came from. And in joining the Imperial Police, I think in many ways seemed a logical thing to do. But I think it also seemed a way to feel more financially comfortable, because though he was very well off growing up, I think as he writes about, he felt his social disadvantage vis-a-vis his very upper-class peers. And in India, it's easy for a white man to live like a king, or it was then. So he enrolls in the Imperial Police, and there's actually a great new novel out now. Some of you might have read it, Burma Sahib by Paul Theroux, which combines a lot of the knowledge of Burma that Theroux has from his travel writing with then a reimagining of Orwell's time as a young police officer in Burma. And this sort of Eric Blair is the central character of the novel. But while in Burma, though he never really eradicates a lot of his racial prejudices that stay with him throughout his life, he develops a clear feeling that the empire is a place of profound informal censorship, where you can never really say what you believe about anything, and because you have to fit in and go along with the crowd and be a Paka Sahib, but also that the empire is deeply exploitative of the native population, and that Britain has a moral obligation to end its imperial project. And so it's that experience as an imperial police officer, and he ultimately, just around Christmas 1927, he comes home on sick leave, and then he engages in quiet quitting, as we would say now. He never goes back. He puts in his resignation a few months later, and he starts what becomes his career as a writer. And his career as a writer is really informed by this desire to combat injustice as he first experienced it in the empire, and some of his greatest essays, including Shooting an Elephant and A Hanging, which some of you may have read. Anyone read one or either or both? Yeah, they're two of his greatest pieces of writing, but are about that imperial experience. But he also then transmutes the understanding of suffering and oppression in the empire into a desire to learn about suffering and oppression at home. As I said, he grew up lower upper middle class. He really had very little sense of working class people and what their life looked like until he comes back from India and decides to seek out the oppressed. And he finds them in amongst the casual laborers and chronic unemployed in London, amongst the dishwashers in Paris, where he lives in his, this is his aunt lives in Paris, but he goes there to become a writer, and failing to become a writer, becomes a tutor and a dishwasher, and then manages to spin that into a book. But then later he travels up to Wigan and around the north of England and writes a first-person account of the both mining communities and the long-term unemployed in the north of England in 1936, when Britain's been in an economic downturn since long before the start of the Great Depression. The slump in the 1920s had already created persistent and long-term unemployment by the time of the stock market crash in October 1929. And he continues his theme of writing about the impact of social inequality on British society, the corrosive impact of social inequality on British society, in the line in The Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius, which he publishes in 1941, early in the Second World War, which is effectively Orwell's roadmap for a better tomorrow. And most people fairly think of Orwell as more of a critic than as someone who proposes concrete, constructive solutions. And that's fair enough. If you think of 1984, An Animal Farmer, really any of his books, they all end on a real bum note. With the exception of The Lion and the Unicorn, which is this optimistic moment where he this is the one where he famously talks about Britain as being a family with the wrong members in charge. And he sees a possibility, the war is a transformative social moment when those wrong, the right members of the family could be put in charge and things could really change in a meaningful way for the better. And one of the things that I look at in the book is the kind of resonances and parallels between those early days of the Second World War and the early period of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you think back to 2020 and to this sort of both the rhetoric, which, the echoes of World War II were all around us then. Remember, we had Dame Vera Lynn coming out and saying we had to all keep calm and carry on, and we were all in it together. I was in York during the pandemic, and it was a wonderful place to spend the pandemic, I have to say. My sister was stuck in a tiny apartment in central DC, and that was not. But there was a sense that, that people had to make sacrifices for one another and for the common weal, and that people had to respect the idea that they were a society. And Orwell has that same optimism in 1941 as he publishes The Lion and the Unicorn. And just as we've seen largely a dispelling of that optimism in the aftermath of 2020, he becomes, by the time of his death in 1949, very cynical, actually, about the possibilities for meaningful social change. So The Lion and the Unicorn is sort of a unique piece of Orwell's writing in that it is uncharacteristically optimistic. But it's not his only moment of optimism. And we see that optimism coming through, too, when he takes the decision to travel to Spain and fight on the behalf of the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. He goes just before Christmas in 1936 and remains there for the first half of 1937. And he volunteers, he sort of just wants to get to Spain, and he just wants to fight fascism as he understands it through the proxy of fighting on behalf of the Republic against Franco's forces. And he doesn't really understand who he's signing up with, but he ends up signing up with the POUM militia and getting credentials as a journalist for Tribune, which is a left-wing newspaper then associated with the ILP, the Independent Labor Party. And so he gets thrown in with a group of more radical revolutionaries within this very heterogeneous Republican coalition. And Barcelona is a very, very radical part of Spain during the conflict, and he writes about it in Homage to Catalonia. And he says, in outward appearance, Barcelona, was a town in which the wealthy classes had practically ceased to exist. Except for a small number of women and foreigners, there were no well-dressed people at all. Practically everyone wore rough working-class clothes or blue overalls or some variant of the militia uniform. All of this was queer and moving. There was much in it that I didn't understand, and in some ways, I did not even like it. But I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. And you get here this sense that this optimism that a classless society would be something, better, maybe potentially achievable, and worth giving your life for, in Orwell's initial reaction to the kind of enthusiasm of revolutionary Spain in early 1937. And I also think it's notable that, despite the fact that 1984 is a society that's a product of a revolution gone sour and gone wrong, it's also a place where everyone wears blue overalls, which was something he saw as a social good when writing about the lack of class distinctions in Barcelona in 1937. But as I said, I really do want to leave time for questions, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about one other theme, and I think talking about his time in Spain is a good segue into it, because Orwell did not go to Spain alone, even though really, unless you got to the very last pages of Homage to Catalonia, you wouldn't know it. But in fact, he travels to Spain and then is joined shortly thereafter by his new wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy Blair. She's 2 years younger than him. She's born September 1905. She's much better educated than him. While he leaves school after Eton, she has both a BA from St. Hugh's College, Oxford, and then an MA from University College London, both in psychology. And she marries Eric Blair as she knows him. She always calls him Eric throughout his life, in June 1936. And then she dies tragically young in March 1945. How many of you guys have read Anna Funder's Wifedom? Any of you? A couple. It came out last year and was a sort of part biography, part fictional reimagining of Eileen Blair's life, which, I mean, the argument of is essentially that Orwell was a bad husband and that Eileen really resented the fact that he was a bad husband. I think the first of those is incontrovertibly true. The more you find out about Orwell, the kind of ickier husband he was. But that the second part is debatable, right? And raises real questions about how we impose our 21st century values on the early 20th century. She effectively, despite her BA and her MA, gives her life to being his helpmeet and amanuensis, types most of his manuscripts for him, gives him editorial advice. And then when she dies young, he's sort of at a loss of what to do without her and ends up proposing to basically every woman he meets until he remarries Sonia Brunel shortly before his death, and she becomes his literary executioner. But though he married this very bright and very accomplished woman, and though he surrounded himself with very bright and very accomplished women, he was not, and this is the note I want to end on, a feminist. And I'll just give you two examples of quotations which I think make clear his somewhat dim view of the feminist movement. So the first is from The Road to Wigan Pier, which is principally, as I said, in its first part, this book of social investigation, really exposing the ways in which the working class are living in the north of England and the long-term unemployed. But the second half is a kind of musing on his own journey to socialism as he's making it at the time. He was then a member of by the time the book is published, the Independent Labour Party, but he's never a doctrinaire socialist. And he sees many socialists as he would call them, cranks. And he writes about this, which really gets a bad reception from some of the members of the Left Book Club. And this was a group of a subscription book service in the 1930s of largely left-wing socialist intellectuals. And Road to Wigan Pier is published in the Left Book Club, and the people that he's slagging off are largely the people who subscribe to the Left Book Club. But he says about socialism, in addition to this, there's a horrible and really disquieting prevalence of cranks whenever socialists are gathered together. One sometimes gets the impression that the mere words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure quack, pacifist, and feminist in England. And I think in some ways, Orwell's a great enumerator. I mean, he likes to overwhelm you through example. But I think there's a real resonance between this passage and a passage from his novel, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, that's published the same year, in which the main character, Gordon Comstock, who's sort of an Orwellian stand-in character, even more of a sad sack than Orwell's, I think, at times saw himself to be, but is, again, slagging off socialism to his friend Ravenstock. And he says, if actually implemented, socialism would probably look like some kind of Aldous Huxley Brave New World, only not so amusing. 4 hours a day in a model factory, tightening up bolt 6003, rations served out in greaseproof paper at a communal kitchen, community hikes from Marx Hostel to Lennon Hostel and back, free abortion clinics on all the corners. And the sort of damnation by association that comes in his description, his tagging both a feminist to the end of his list of different types of quacks, and abortion clinics onto the list of things that would be awful about a genuine socialist society if ever one were to come, I think gives you an insight into his attitudes towards towards socialism or towards feminism, even though he was increasingly conceiving himself as perhaps a reluctant socialist in this period. He would later call himself a democratic socialist. And just for context, the abortion movement in 1930s Britain is very much tied up with feminist politics. The Abortion Law Reform Association is started in 1937 by a group of feminists, and there's a much longer and better organized anti-abortion movement in Britain, actually, than in the United States, where the anti-abortion movement doesn't actually organize in a coherent way until the 1960s. So, the association between abortion rights and feminism in the minds of his readers at the time would have been clear, and this kind of, this is one of the crankish aspects of socialism that they associate with these feminists, comes through in both of those passages. And so I do, in the book, look at his sexual politics, and I think it raises a question because the book attempts to make an argument that Orwell really should be reclaimed by the political left, that it is not the Josh Hawleys and Trump Juniors who own Orwell's legacy, but those democratic socialists who want to fight oppression wherever they see it, rather on the left or on the right. But I think there is a question that is worth asking ourselves about to what extent, or whether at all, to be a socialist meant to be a feminist in the 30s and 40s, or indeed to what extent it does today. And that's one of the themes that the book explores in more detail. But on that note, I'm going to go back to, I'll let you look at the cover of the book while we have Q&A. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Laura. So if you'd like to ask Laura a question, please raise your hand. We'll get to as many as we can.
It's very disconcerting. All I see is like lights coming at me. I can't really see. Yeah.
Hello. You've subtitled your book "Warnings for the 21st Century," but what do you think of the view that Orwell was actually just a pessimist and that he thought that totalitarianism might just be inevitable and that he was influenced by maybe James Burnham's managerial revolution?
Well, I think Orwell himself refuted that, and he makes a point in writing to a member of the United Auto Workers in response to a letter sent to him after the publication of 1984 in the United States. And then that letter is republished in the New York Times Book Review and a few other venues, in which he says, I want to be clear that this book is a parody. It is not a critique of socialism, and I consider myself a socialist, but it is also, not, I can find the quote for you actually, because he puts it better than I will, that this is a world that I could envisage something like this happening, but not one, hopefully, that will actually come to pass. And it is, and he uses the word parody to describe it, that it is very much a parody. And I think he is someone who is pessimistic, but as I said, one of the things that I love about the Lion and the Unicorn is, even though it's short-lived, it is this period where this optimism that you see in other places, like when he talks about the social organization during the revolutionary period and the conflict in Spain, where he does seem optimistic about the possibilities for change, but he's just very conscious of that tension. And I mean, that's where I think the warnings comes in, that it's a fine line, and that you do need to have both, freedom and liberty, but also integrity to walk that fine line without ending up in dystopia.
Thank you, Laura. My memory of Homage to Catalonia is that he seemed a total innocent in terms of the realities of a muddled conflict. I mean, that's what I recall, that he was disillusioned beyond measure.
And, well, yes. I mean, I think one of the things that's quite nice about Homage to Catalonia for teaching, and I actually first read it in a 20th century European history undergraduate course, and I think it's great for teaching, is that he's working out what's really going on in Spain as he's writing. And so you then, as a student, can work out what's really going on in Spain, and he comes with this total naivete. And then he over his time in Spain, he comes to realize the degree to which Stalin's Russia, who is funding the Republic, is really pulling the strings of the socialist government and is attempting to purge more radical dissident elements on the left with which they don't agree. Because Stalin's policy is that, at this point, is defeat fascism first, and then the revolution later, and he doesn't support these groups who want to simultaneously defeat fascism and have a social revolution. And those are the groups that Orwell really admires. And so he does become deeply disillusioned by the time that he leaves Spain. And he leaves Spain actually on the tail of being hunted down by government forces on Stalin's orders. But he then writes Homage to Catalonia, which he struggles to get published because many in the anti-fascist left in Britain don't want to hear about how messy things really are in Spain. They just want to hear that the Republic needs to win so fascism can be defeated. But he does say at the end, despite all of this, I still believed that the Republic should win. And he is very clear on that point, and he's explicit about it in the book. And so his disillusionment with Stalin really grows out of the experience of the Spanish Civil War, but for his volunteering in Spain, there would be no Animal Farm, and there would be no 1984. But he does still believe in the revolution despite the way that the Stalinists have perverted it. That's maybe evidence of his optimism.
Thank you. He's obviously becoming sicker and sicker, seriously ill, towards the end of the war. How do you think that impacted on his cynicism and his just general mental, I hesitate to say health, but how did he see the world as he's dying?
I mean, I think there is a real pessimism that comes with knowing he's dying. And there's an irony. I mean, in some ways, the NHS, the kind of great achievement of the first Attlee government, comes just too late for Orwell, who does manage to get his hands on penicillin. He has tuberculosis, from which he ultimately dies, and he dies quite young. He dies in January 1950 at, does that make him not quite 47? So basically, frighteningly my age. So he dies very young. No, but he knows he's dying as he's writing the book, and I think that pessimism really imbues the writing. But he's also writing it, in the Scottish Highlands on the island of Jura, where he rents a cottage, and so there's a kind of desolate environment in which he's writing as well, which I think all of that kind of helps to funnel the bleakness that you see in 1984, which, though none of Orwell's novels end with a happy ending, is really by far and away the bleakest of his writing, right? And so I think it does have an impact, certainly.
Thank you very much, Laura. I was really struck by your earlier comment about how your students, as they were immediately withdrawn to contemporary resonances on the reading, and probably your answer is going to be by the book, which I will do, but I was wondering if you'd like to say more about what you think was behind that kind of ready response to a contemporary situation. Did they articulate it in particular ways, or?
The way that they articulated the connections they saw. Actually, one of the connections I didn't talk about, so I first taught the course on Zoom during the pandemic because I'd been in York on research leave from American University in DC when the pandemic happened, when it started. And so everyone else who had been teaching that spring had been forced to figure out Zoom over the spring. And now we all know how to do Zoom, but no one knew how to do Zoom then. And I thought, I'm going to have to learn Zoom. So I volunteered to do a Zoom summer course on Orwell. And it was actually the greatest course I ever taught in terms of students being really engaged in the reading because they were trapped at home with their parents and their siblings. They had no one else to talk to. They read every word. They would then talk to their parents and their siblings at dinner about Orwell, and they would come ready to, excited to discuss it with the only other people they ever communicated with, who were the people in this Zoom room. It was a great class, but one of the many connections that they made several with kind of Trumpian disinformation, but also they asked me about whether Orwell would be canceled now. And this is, I think, June 2022. I never really heard the term canceled in terms of, this is just as the Me Too movement is kicking off, right? And I discuss the Me Too movement in the book in relation to Orwell. And I hadn't really heard what to cancel someone, to sort of basically throw the baby out with the bathwater because they had disreputable aspects of their way they treated particularly women and people of color and kind of other things that are just icky about them. And we got into this whole discussion, I remember in one of our seminars, Bill, about whether or not Orwell should be canceled, because he is, the more you read, particularly there are parts of Burmese Days that are really just unsettling if you're reading it as a woman of color in particular. But, and ultimately, the students came down on the side of, which is the position that I tend to take, that no, we should read him critically and with eyes wide open about the extent that he is, a person in full who did have this massive, message and legacy and has left behind this body of writing, but who is as problematic as most people are, and to understand the ways that he's problematic, but to look at him in that context as opposed to dismiss him because of his less savory aspects of his personality, and particularly, which I discuss in the book, his attitudes towards women in his writing. And it really isn't, the book is very little about his personal life. There's kind of, if you want a very short biography of Orwell, the first chapter is a kind of short biography, but it's engaging with his writing and his ideas. And so he wasn't, he was kind of sketchy in his personal life, but it's really about the way he writes about women and the way he writes about gender that I look at in the book. But they also then, they picked up on a lot of, I haven't taught the course since the beginning of the conflict in Gaza, but I'm sure that the next time I teach it, the way that students react will be very much inflected by those events. But they're quick to make those connections, right? And it really inspired me, I think, in a lot of ways to write the book, the way that they saw the links between the past and the present so rapidly.
If Orwell had have got the antibiotics in time and had survived, where do you think he would have gone? Do you think he would have got more optimistic, more pessimistic, or what?
It's a hard, and I'm very clear at the beginning that it's so easy to say, I think that someone who's dead would do X because they can't say, no, I wouldn't, right? And Orwell has been used and repurposed over time by so many people. And they've sort of used him as an avatar for themselves. Christopher Hitchens, I think, saw himself as the latter-day Orwell and basically wrote a book on Orwell where he basically sort of said, Orwell is me and I am Orwell and we. And I don't pretend to that. And it's hard to think. As he was dying, it was clear that he was disappointed in the Labour government and the sort of statist trajectory that the Attlee government had taken, and that he had hoped for a more communitarian socialism. Particularly, he'd hoped for the abolition of private schools, which didn't happen. The irony of that, and there are so many conversations that one could have on, is that he hoped for the abolition of private schools, but then when he saw it wasn't happening, he put his own child down for a private school because he thought, if they're gonna stick around, better the best for my boy. But he also, his view of socialism was always one that was much more, much more social and cultural and less about kind of a statist, Stalinist view of socialism. And he was disappointed at the kind of statist direction that the Attlee government seemed to be going by the time he passes away. So I don't know, but I don't think he's as pessimistic as 1984, written in this moment of acute physical pain as suggests. And also, his wife had died just a few. It was not a great period for him. So I think he sort of ended life on a down note, kind of. So I would hope, had he not passed away when he did, that he would find more to be hopeful about, as well as nervous about the future.
Hi. I was just wondering, because I've just finished an essay on George Bernard Shaw, who was very similar to Orwell. They were very complex men, but one of the defining features of Shaw was he was very much on the side of sort of women's rights in his own complex kind of way. And I was just wondering if you've sort of seen maybe how does Orwell's kind of misogynistic tendencies fit into that cultural of sort of early British socialism with things like the Fabian Society?
Well, I think actually, famously, Orwell and Shaw have this big falling out, and they hold this, after a dinner party where they have a big grudge against each other. I don't know if you came across it as you were writing your essay, which it must be a relief to have handed in. Congratulations. But I wouldn't say that Orwell is a misogynist so much as just instinctively a chauvinist. And I think that's part and parcel of what his sister referred to. She would call him a Tory anarchist. And several of his other friends at various points referred to him as a Tory radical. And there is a sort of streak of social conservatism, and I think that extends to ideas about the gender order. And you see it in his essay that he writes when the war breaks out in My Country, Right or Left, when he sort of says, obviously, like all decent people can't help but want to sort of stand and salute when they hear God save the king, and he has kind of traditional ideas about the social order, which I think kind of stop him from being able to embrace feminism. But his problems with Shaw are actually partially to do with Shaw's mistress, and he is just kind of he hits on everyone he sees, and he's a problematic figure in many ways. But I don't think, one of the themes of the book is that while most feminists in the 30s and 40s, as now, identify with the political left, being in the political left does not necessarily make you a feminist. And there certainly are feminist men within the political left in the 30s and 40s as there are today, but that the left in its broad umbrella includes a lot of people now as then with views on gender that are much more similar to Orwell's.
Thanks, Laura. Great talk, very entertaining, and a great insight into Orwell's life. He's such a complex character with so many different aspects to his life. You think of the things he did, Catalonia, living on the streets of Paris, even going to Jura and all that, writing 1984 there. And he's a character who engages the public, undeniably. And I wonder, without being too controversial, how much you wonder, is our fascination with him to do with him and all of that, and a complex, amazing life full of contradictions, and how much is it the quality of his writing? And I'm just thinking about, it's a long time since I've read it, but if you look at 1984 Animal Farm, amazing visionary images, but the other stuff, and okay, it's quite a short oeuvre, it's quite a short body of work, but it didn't quite have the same thing about it. So to what extent is it our fascination with him, and to what extent is it the actual quality of his work, do you think?
It's interesting. So when he went to school, both to prep school and then to Eton with Cyril Connolly, and then they lost touch with each other when he was in Burma in the Imperial Police, and then they came back together and reignited their friendship later in his life. But ironically, Connolly reviewed Burmese Days, which he published under his nom de plume, as he did all his other novels, and did not realize when he was reviewing it that this was his old school friend from when they were 12 years old on. And reviewed it very positively. And then he later realized that it was written by Eric Blair, as he had known him then. But I do think that his earlier writing, there were some of them, Orwell wanted A Clergyman's Daughter to be completely suppressed. He hated it in retrospect, and didn't want it to see the light of day again. And he had writing that he was negative about. But I think his body of writing holds up fairly well. It's interesting, when he died, and I read through all of his obituaries that I could find after his death, and the American ones, he's really only known for 1984 and Animal Farm, and they only mention those two in talking about him. But in Britain, he's referred to as one of the great left intellectuals of his time, at the point at which, and this is even in the Times of London, like even in more conservative papers are giving him this moniker of one of the great writers of the left of the past 20 years. And I think part of that is just because of a respect for his writing, and principally, while I enjoy his longer form work. I love his essays. And I do think that Politics in the English Language, My Country, Right or Left, Hanging, Shooting an Elephant are kind of beautiful pieces of writing. And in the US, you don't just, when you study for a degree at university, you don't just study for a politics degree and take nothing but politics courses. You tend to have like a humanist core curriculum that everyone has to take no matter what they're studying. And my Orwell course is offered as part of the core curriculum. And I never cease to note the number of journalism students who sign up for the course, even though it really is, more literature and history. And I think it's because journalism students still look to Orwell's short form writing as, they still read it. It's still a way they come to think of how to write good, clear, sharp prose. So I'm going to disagree with the premise. And though I do think there are some of his novels are flabbier than others, I think he is an excellent writer. And it's one of the things I like most about him. I also think he's very funny. He has a very dry, very droll sense of humor that comes through in his writing.
Time for one last question. Yeah.
To be honest, I was a little bit stunned when you started the talk explaining how in America Orwell was taught, because my perception of him was very much from down and out in London, Paris and such like, and the socialism, and when you're describing him the way he's understood. So is there a complete difference of perception of Orwell in Britain and in America, would you say?
I think it's partially generational, right? I mean, I think in the 60s to 80s, probably you'd be more likely to have gotten a sort of school version of Orwell that is much more the 1984 Animal Farm version, both in Britain, the US, and continental Europe. I think, interestingly, what's happened since then is that Orwell's disappeared from American curriculum almost entirely, other than his short essays, which, as I said, are read by, from my experience, students in journalism classes. And interestingly, I was talking to, my older boy is 12, so he's just started secondary school. And he said he's doing this kind of elective course called digital literacy, but it's taught by the English teacher for year 9. And he saw a whole bunch of copies of Animal Farm in her classroom. And so he asked her, are we going to read Animal Farm in year 9? And she said, well, the state has taken it off of the curriculum, but Pyle continues to secretly assign it under the radar. So I think that's, Orwell is being phased out, though fortunately for me, for some reason, my son's school is keeping it on the curricula. And I think in Britain, you're more likely to read Homage, or to read, particularly much more likely to read Down and Out. And actually, I came to Down and Out not from any US curriculum, but just when I was visiting Britain, and I picked it up in a Waterstones. And I just had never seen it before. And that was my introduction to Down and Out when I was 21. And so you get a more nuanced view of Orwell, but I also think that he's always had a more nuanced reputation here. That's why in the US, Elon Musk and Trump Jr. and Hawley can think that he's a Cold Warrior and kind of their mascot. Whereas you're unlikely to have that preconception on this side of the Atlantic.
Okay, well, that's, I think the time's up. Thank you so much, Laura. So Fox Lane Books have her books available if you would like her to sign it. She's very happy to take some time to sign your copies. I'd also like to thank you for your participation in York's Festival of Ideas.